Boomer shooters. Originally intended to be an angsty jab at older FPS games, has actually grabbed more mainstream appeal as an FPS subgenre, cementing itself with an official genre tab on Steam here a few weeks ago. To bring us to a baseline on what this genre actually is, I would describe these games as an FPS with a retro aesthetic, usually inspired by 90s FPS titles like Doom, Quake, or Unreal Tournament. They typically consist of fast-paced gameplay with gore-heavy violence and killer soundtracks, and I love them. Or at least I tend to. Now, to be totally honest, I'm pretty average at these games. However, I recently impulse bought a lot of them over a Steam sale, and now I have a good deal of experience playing them. So I figured, why not take some time to talk about them, see if they were a mistake, or if they're worth my time and maybe yours. So with that being said, let's talk about the first of the three I played recently, Nightmare Reaper. In Nightmare Reaper, we play as a patient in a mental institute where every time we go to sleep, we get pulled into a nightmare. These nightmares are the majority of the gameplay. We fight through rooms of enemies, picking up randomly dropped weapons along the way. These weapons vary in rarity and modifiers that can alter the way they work. Some modifiers can include a randomized projectile or changing the size of your bullets, or something more basic as lighting enemies on fire or freezing them. This can make some interesting combinations, such as shooting bowling balls that take up your entire screen, or black holes that will light enemies in the room on fire. At the end of each level, we get to pick one of these weapons to bring with us into our next nightmare, and the rest are sold for varying amounts of money, which can be used towards our upgrades. Afterwards, we are promptly kicked back to the waking world, where we are stuck in our room. At least, that's at first. As we progress, we slowly begin unlocking doors and rooms in the hospital, whether that's due to a power outage unlocking a door, a keycard being left with us, or a table that is preventing doors from closing. Something else in your room that changes between runs is lore notes. The doctor examining us writes notes that divulge the patient's history and mental condition. These are fully voice acted and easily the strongest driving force to keep progressing through the game, and the team behind Nightmare Reaper seem to care a great deal for this story, but it at times feel like they're pushing just a little too hard for an edgy background that it can be a bit off-putting. While exploring the hospital, you stumble upon another bed pretty early on that allows us to access the game's arena mode. To me, this mode is where you can see the game's true potential as a boomer shooter, but also its biggest flaws. In a typical boomer shooter, you are progressing through levels and get locked into mini arenas where you fight off a wave or two of enemies before progressing. Nightmare Reaper's arenas mode allows us to get that experience in full. I found this to be the most fast-paced, intense part of the game. This also shows, however, where the main campaign for the game begins to fall short. I was never really encouraged to go full pace into a room to fight enemies and be challenged. Instead, it was more beneficial for me to open the door to the next room and let the enemies slowly funnel themselves towards me, creating an easy choke point with the door to passively clear rooms. Something else we're talking about is the upgrade tree. There are a handful of upgrade currencies in the game, to include gold, topaz, and jade. Each upgrade tree is in the format of a mini game on a Game Boy Advance. Initially, these are really charming, but as you play more, they begin to break up the tempo, where you can be mid-level and are now playing knockoff Mario to purchase an upgrade. Or worse, playing multiple levels of Mario, Pokemon, or Galaga because you've saved up thousands. These upgrades change the amount of ammo stored, health, or currency earned, but never felt overly necessary. Fortunately, I think the devs agreed with this assessment, as there is an option to turn each game off independently in case you like one but not the others. I would talk about the level structure more heavily, but there isn't too much to be said overall. You play through 3 levels before the stage changes, and every handful of stages you'll encounter a boss. These bosses are typically just larger variants of common enemies with a health bar on screen. In the second half of the game, the devs did add a grapple hook, but I found its usefulness fairly limited as there isn't much room for vertical movement. The caveat is that there is loads of breakable walls in each stage that often contain Easter eggs and money for upgrades. Some of these were really cool and others went over my head. Despite that, I appreciate their inclusion and felt I would be doing the game a disservice not mentioning them. With most of my deaths not coming from enemies, but the environment, I can't say the game is particularly challenging. The playtime is definitely longer than I'd like, sitting around 11 hours and no end in sight. I'd say that while you are getting a good dollar per hour, the grind and rough pacing makes the game less enjoyable than I was hoping for. With that, let's talk about Prodeus.
Going into Prodeus, I had zero expectations. I'd heard good reviews, and after watching its trailer on Steam, I was eager to see what the game had in store. Prodeus wears its Doom inspirations on its sleeve. From the weapons, to the enemies, to the story themes, this game is oozing love for the genre-inspiring title. With weapons like the super shotgun, and being a one-man killing machine against the armies of hell, it's hard not to draw comparisons. However, that didn't limit the team's ambitions when making this. The sprite work for the game's models are above 16 or 32-bit graphics like Nightmare Reaper, but stay below photorealism that gives Prodeus a very unique look, allowing them to use more highly defined models and textures without losing the retro aesthetic. This difference in textures also comes through heavily with the lighting. The initial opening sequence, where you're trying to escape from a dying spaceship, immediately sets the game apart graphically from its counterparts. The alterations to form also come through with story progression. While the level design is fairly linear, the main campaign missions are laid out on an overworld map, where you can select missions or replay old ones aiming for better times, scores, or looking for missing secrets. Some missions also hold hidden exits that allow you to skip to later sections of the game. Despite having that, I never felt like pursuing them because each area's secrets would possess new weapons early or ore which can be used for buying and unlocking weapon or movement upgrades at the various shop locations around the world map. There are also a handful of weapon-specific challenges that are sprinkled around the map that offer another avenue of earning ore. Something worth pointing out is that while some levels can feel a bit repetitive or fail to stand out, the ones that do really go above and beyond. One that stands out pretty heavily involves you destroying objects to erase platforms in an acid lake. And as you play through the mission, you raise the water level until you reach the end and drain the acid entirely, leaving you to decide how you want to get down, by jumping between what were previously unreachable islands in the lake that have now become mountaintops in a freshly emptied ravine. The level design, combined with the fluid combat and movement mechanics, carried me through my time with Prodeus, to the point where I played the entire 7-hour campaign in one sitting. It wasn't until my corneas were throbbing that I realized I actually had no idea what the game story was really about. I had the context clues from the environment and the brief lore notes I found in a handful of secrets, but the real meat of the storytelling comes from the mission icons on the overworld. Here, you can read an excerpt about what you're entering the level to do. I have since gone back and fully cleared a few levels just for fun, but never felt the need to learn the story, as the gameplay carries Prodeus on its own. With the new DLC for Prodeus, called the Elder Veil, slated for release later this year, I am planning to make a full return as they've teased new weapons, vertical level design benefiting from a freshly added grapple hook, and new enemy types that subvert the typical demon approach with beautifully savage angels. I may come back to fully complete the game, as I'm only a handful of achievements from the 100%, but in the meantime, let's move on to our next game, Forgive Me Father. Graphically, Forgive Me Father stands out as the most unique of the 3 games we've discussed. Everything has this hand-drawn look that perfectly encapsulates the aesthetic and grim tones of the game. We play as one of 2 characters, the priest or the reporter. Story-wise, there's little to no difference. However, they differ with abilities. Both characters get 4 abilities pretty early on in the game, and to use them you have to charge them using Insanity. We build Insanity as we kill enemies in rapid succession. This is visually represented not with a bar, but with your screen slowly fading from color to black and white. Every time you do this, you gain access to a charge of an ability. If the black and white color change for you is too much, like it was for me, you are able to turn this off in the game settings, which is really quite nice. The priest can use a crucifix to heal himself, holy water to stun nearby enemies, a Necronomicon provides temporary invulnerability, and a medallion to give us infinite ammo. Alternatively, the reporter has a sword that will heal you as you damage enemies, a camera which acts like a stun, a voodoo doll that creates a small explosion, and cigarettes which slows time. Of the 2, I feel the priest was more enjoyable to play. I found some of the dialogue lines from the reporter a little annoying the longer into her story I played. The main meat of the campaign starts with us receiving a letter from our cousin saying that he needs us to come to his town as there's something strange happening. Upon arriving, we are attacked by mutated townspeople, and this begins our descent into chaos. The farther we progress into our search for our cousin, the more the townspeople deform into these Cthulhian monsters, spawning tentacles and other fishy deformed appendages to try to kill us. The locals aren't the only thing growing tentacles though. Our weapons can be imbued with this Cthulhian goodness, which we can get from upgrading as we earn levels. One example is we can improve our starting knife to a high damage machete, or we can upgrade it into a tentacle blade that we can throw from range and it'll chew into our enemies upon impact. Different weapons take different ammo types,
and as we upgrade, we can change it to where they use alternative ammo. We can also use these upgrades to improve our abilities, extending the duration once activated, or we can increase our health pool and armor depending on which path we choose. Some upgrades lock depending on your selection, encouraging experimentation and replaying. For instance, my first playthrough was with the Priest, and I cleared the entire game without ever respecking my upgrades. So on my second playthrough with the Reporter, I experimented, choosing some different options, and it created a wildly different experience. There are 3 main bosses as we progress, one at the end of each world, and while not challenging overall, they're a cool change of pace throughout the game. My favorite being the final boss, which is the only one that managed to kill me. Now these weren't something I was expecting, so encountering the first one was a pleasant surprise, and it really gave me something to look forward to as I played farther through the game. Additionally, we unlocked different endless dungeons. They're a fun twist and a surprising challenge, and ammo in these is scarce, so there's very little time to slow down and catch your breath, and being able to react on your feet and take full advantage of both character abilities is a must. I really can't praise this game enough, from visuals to combat to soundtrack. Forgive Me Father delivered on every front. How many games can you name that are shooters and still introduce new enemies into the last third of the game? With a sequel currently in early access, Forgive Me Father 2, my hopes are high, and with such high praise, to me that's the best way to send things off. So if you made it this far, thank you. We will see if I keep doing these in the future.